The world we live in is full of noise, constant distractions, endless demands, and the rush to achieve. It pulls us in every direction, often leading us to believe that we must keep striving, accumulating, and proving ourselves in order to be valuable. But what if the opposite is true? What if the path to true fulfillment lies not in gaining, but in letting go? The teachings of St. Francis offer us a different way, one that points to simplicity, humility, and a deeper relationship with God. When we look at his life, we see a man who chose to relinquish everything, wealth, status, and even his own desires, to follow Christ more closely. This radical choice was not out of a desire to suffer, but out of a deep understanding that true peace and joy come when we surrender to God's will and trust that He is enough. Many of us are so entangled in the pursuit of worldly things, be it possessions, prestige, or power, that we cannot imagine living without them. It feels as if we would be incomplete without these markers of success. And yet, St. Francis challenges us to see the emptiness in all of it. The truth he lived is that fulfillment does not come from the things we accumulate, but from the love and grace we share with others and receive from God. He teaches us that it is only when we let go of our attachment to these things that we can truly open our hearts to God and His infinite love. St. Francis's example is not one of self-imposed poverty for its own sake, but a spiritual poverty that leads to freedom. By stripping away the layers of pride and self-interest, we come closer to the heart of God. It is no accident that the Gospel speaks so much about the poor in spirit. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 5:3. This passage doesn't refer to physical poverty alone, but to the spiritual poverty that Jesus himself embraced. True poverty of spirit is the willingness to surrender all to God, to empty oneself so that God's grace can fill every corner of the soul. Imagine for a moment the freedom St. Francis must have felt when he let go of his wealth and his status. He didn't cling to anything, no material possession, no reputation. He embraced the poor, the sick, and the outcasts, seeing in them the very face of Christ. When he walked through the towns, he didn't do so as a man of authority or prestige. He walked humbly, knowing that true greatness lies in serving others, not in being served. Can you picture the peace he must have had in his heart, not weighed down by possessions or a need to prove his worth? There is a simple prayer that captures this spirit of surrender.
When we pray this prayer with sincerity, we ask God to transform our hearts, to help us see the world with the eyes of St. Francis, to see Christ in all people and to serve them with love, without expectation of reward. This is the kind of prayer that can change not just our outlook, but our entire way of life. St. Francis's radical life of poverty, simplicity, and love is an invitation for us to reflect on our own lives. What are we holding on to? What are we so attached to that it keeps us from experiencing the fullness of God's love? Are we so caught up in the pursuit of material success that we forget what truly matters, our relationship with God and with one another? Perhaps in our own lives, we can begin to practice small acts of detachment. Maybe it's setting aside a few moments each day to reflect on what we've accumulated, whether it's possessions, grudges, or even ambitions, and surrendering it to God. Perhaps it's letting go of the desire to be recognized or praised, and instead seeking to serve others in humility. These small acts of surrender lead to larger acts of love and openness, and through them we begin to experience the true peace that St. Francis found. As we reflect on these lessons from the life of St. Francis, let us remember that the freedom he found was not in having less, but in desiring less. It was not in giving up what he had, but in receiving the fullness of God's grace. Each moment of our lives is an invitation to live more simply, to let go of what keeps us from God, and to embrace the radical love that Francis embodied. May we too have the courage to follow in his footsteps, trusting that in surrendering all to God, we will find the kingdom of heaven on earth. Call to subscribe. Join us on this journey of spiritual growth. Let us walk together in the path of humility, simplicity, and love. Subscribe to continue learning and reflecting on the deeper truths that St. Francis offers us. St. Francis lived a life of profound simplicity, but his simplicity was not born out of naivete or escapism, it was born from a deep understanding of the world's fleeting nature. Francis grasped something fundamental, that the treasures of this world are temporary and fleeting, and true wealth lies in God's love. His life was not about renouncing material goods out of a desire for punishment, but rather a heartfelt embrace of the true riches found in spiritual communion with God. And through his radical example, he showed the world that all that glitters in the world is not gold. The essence of what is truly valuable can often be found in the poorest, the weakest, and those who have nothing to give. In his encounters with the poor and the sick, St. Francis saw the face of Christ. His life teaches us that when we turn away from worldly wealth and fame, we open ourselves to the deeper, more lasting treasures of God's grace. The famous story of St. Francis and the leper highlights this.
Before his conversion, Francis feared lepers, seeing them as the very embodiment of suffering and ugliness. Yet, one day, when faced with a leper begging for alms, Francis did the unthinkable. He embraced him. In that moment, he encountered not just the physical suffering of the man, but the suffering of Christ. In embracing the leper, he was embracing Christ himself. This act of embracing the unworthy changed Francis forever. It was a radical shift in his thinking and in his understanding of love. To love those whom society rejects and fears is to love in the way Christ did. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. Christ's words resonate in the heart of St. Francis. He understood that the poor, the outcasts, and those suffering were not to be avoided or rejected, but embraced. And in this embrace, he discovered the true essence of love and the grace of God. As we reflect on this story, it becomes clear that St. Francis didn't just give material possessions to those in need. He gave something much more valuable: his love, his time, his attention, and his willingness to see Christ in the most broken of people. In doing so, he not only changed their lives, but his own. He experienced a deep spiritual transformation because he learned to see the world differently, to see it through the eyes of love. In our own lives, we too are called to see beyond the surface. How often do we avoid those whom we deem unworthy or undeserving of our time or love? How often do we turn away from the suffering in our own communities or in our own families, thinking it's too much for us to handle? St. Francis teaches us that true love requires us to approach suffering not with fear or disgust, but with compassion and mercy. And by doing so, we encounter Christ in the most profound way. Consider the next time you encounter someone in need, whether it is someone in poverty, someone who is marginalized, or someone who is suffering physically or emotionally. What is your initial reaction? Do you walk by, pretending not to notice? Or do you take a moment to see beyond the surface, to see the human being in front of you, deserving of love and compassion? St. Francis teaches us that true transformation happens when we choose to embrace, to love, and to serve. If you find it difficult to see Christ in those who suffer or those who seem unworthy, consider this simple prayer: Lord, open my eyes to see you in all people, especially those whom society rejects. Help me to embrace the suffering around me and to love as you love. Transform my heart so that I may serve with humility and compassion, without seeking anything in return. In praying this prayer, we invite God to change our hearts, to help us grow in love and to open our eyes to the beauty of the world as He sees it.
The lesson from St. Francis's life is clear. We are not called to love others only when it's convenient or when it's easy. We are called to love others when it's hard, when it costs us something, and when we are faced with the suffering of the world. By doing so, we not only change the lives of others, but we also transform our own hearts. We grow closer to God, and we begin to understand the deeper meaning of His love. Just as St. Francis embraced the leper, we are invited to embrace the brokenness around us with love, seeing in each person the face of Christ. As we reflect on these teachings, let us remember that it is not the wealth of the world that gives us true peace, but the wealth of love and service. St. Francis found that the more he gave, the more he received, not material wealth, but spiritual wealth. And in this wealth, he found a deep and lasting joy. Let us too seek this joy by embracing love, humility, and simplicity, following the example of St. Francis. Question for comments. How have you experienced love and transformation in moments where you chose to serve or embrace someone in need? St. Francis's radical approach to poverty was not about mere deprivation. It was a call to empty oneself of all attachments that prevent us from fully embracing God's will. His life was a testament to the truth that when we surrender our desires for comfort, power, and wealth, we make space for God to fill us with His peace and grace. But this surrender is not a passive act. It is a conscious decision to let go of what the world values in order to embrace what God values: humility, simplicity, and love. In the Gospel, we are reminded, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Matthew 6:21. St. Francis lived this teaching fully. He gave up his wealth, his family's expectations, and his status as a young man of privilege to follow Christ. This choice was not driven by a desire to suffer, but by an understanding that true life and freedom are found in surrender to God's will. Francis discovered that the more he let go of his attachment to worldly things, the more he was able to receive the abundant life that Christ offers. It is in this paradox that the heart of the Christian life is found. In losing, we gain. In giving, we receive. One of the most powerful moments in St. Francis's life occurred when he was praying before the crucifix in the church of San Damiano. He heard Christ speak to him, saying, "Francis, go and repair my house, which as you see is falling into ruin." This moment of profound clarity changed the course of his life. It was not just a call to rebuild a physical structure. It was a spiritual invitation to rebuild the church, to restore the true spirit of Christ's love and humility. In this moment, St. Francis received a profound understanding. To follow Christ means to be willing to rebuild the brokenness of the world by living a life of self-sacrificial love.
St. Francis responded to this call with utter surrender. He did not question, he did not hesitate. He left behind everything, his family's wealth, his friends, his comfortable life, because he knew that only by surrendering his own desires could he fully live the life Christ intended for him. And in this surrender, Francis found true freedom. He did not lose his life. Rather, he found it in a way that most of us can only imagine. Through his poverty, he discovered richness in God's love. Through his simplicity, he found the depth of spiritual peace that eludes so many. As we reflect on St. Francis's radical choice, we must ask ourselves, what are we holding on to that keeps us from following Christ with the same abandonment? What attachments, whether material, emotional, or spiritual, prevent us from experiencing the fullness of God's grace? Perhaps it is our desire for control or our need for recognition and status. Maybe we are clinging to a certain comfort or security that keeps us from stepping into the unknown, trusting only in God's providence. The call to poverty, as St. Francis understood it, is not about renouncing all things for the sake of suffering. Rather,
It is about renouncing our attachment to the things of this world that distract us from our ultimate purpose, to love God and serve others. When we let go of these attachments, we create space for God's love to flow into our lives, transforming us from the inside out. St. Francis also showed us that this surrender is not simply an individual act. It is part of a greater mission to serve the world. His life was not just about personal piety. It was about restoring the church and healing the brokenness of society. When he chose poverty, he chose to serve the poor, the sick, and the marginalized. He lived the gospel not in words alone, but in actions. This is the true meaning of following Christ. It is not enough to profess our faith. We must live it, especially in how we treat others. Consider this prayer as you reflect on your own attachments. Lord, grant me the strength to surrender my heart to you fully. Help me to let go of the things that keep me from following you wholeheartedly. May my life be a reflection of your love and humility, and may I serve others in the same way that you served me. By praying this prayer, we open ourselves to the possibility of transformation. We invite God to help us let go of the attachments that hinder our spiritual growth and allow us to live more freely and lovingly. And in that freedom, we begin to understand the true joy that comes from surrendering to God's will. St. Francis lived out this profound truth. The more he surrendered, the more he gained. He gained a deep and abiding relationship with God, a profound peace that transcended circumstances, and a life filled with love and service to others.
His example is a challenge to us all, to live not for ourselves, but for the sake of others, and in doing so, to find the truest form of life, the life that Christ offers. Practical application. Consider an area in your life where you feel resistant to surrender. It could be a relationship, a material possession, or a certain desire or ambition. Take a moment each day to surrender this area to God. Offer it in prayer, asking for His help in letting go of your attachment. As you do this, pay attention to how God's peace begins to fill the spaces where your attachments once were. In the life of St. Francis, we find the perfect model of surrender, a surrender that leads to greater freedom and a deeper connection to God. May we too have the courage to follow his example, embracing a life of humility, simplicity, and love.
Through this radical view, St. Francis found meaning in his own pain. He didn't just endure suffering, he embraced it with gratitude, knowing that in doing so, he was participating in the work of salvation. His response to suffering was one of love, not bitterness, of grace, not resentment. This is a challenging perspective for many of us, for it requires us to shift how we view pain in our own lives. Consider how we approach our own moments of hardship. When we face struggles, whether they are physical, emotional, or spiritual, how do we respond? Do we seek to avoid them, to escape? Or do we, like St. Francis, find meaning and purpose in the midst of them? The challenge is not to seek suffering for the sake of suffering, but to recognize that when it comes, it can be an opportunity for spiritual growth. St. Francis also teaches us that in suffering we must not withdraw from the world, but rather remain engaged in service to others. His life was a testament to the idea that true love is expressed not just in words, but in actions. Even as he suffered, he continued to care for others. His empathy and compassion were not limited to those who were well or prosperous. He ministered to the sick, the poor, and the lepers. Even his own health was failing. This too is a powerful lesson for us. The depth of our love is not measured by our comfort or ease, but by our willingness to serve others, especially when it costs us something. St. Francis's embrace of suffering is a profound invitation for each of us. It is an invitation to transform the way we view the difficulties in our own lives. Instead of seeing them as obstacles to our happiness, we can choose to see them as opportunities to draw closer to God. This does not mean that we seek out suffering, but it does mean that when it arrives, we can face it with grace and trust that God will use it for our growth. A prayer inspired by St. Francis might go like this: Lord, help me to accept the suffering that comes my way not with resistance, but with openness. Teach me to embrace it as a means of drawing closer to you. Help me to offer my pain and my struggles as a sacrifice of love, knowing that you will transform them into something good. May I serve others even in the midst of my own difficulties, and may I always trust in your grace to sustain me. In our own lives, let us take St. Francis as our guide. Let us face suffering not with fear, but with faith. Let us embrace it as an opportunity to share in the love of Christ and to serve others with the same compassion that He showed us. Just as Christ's suffering brought salvation to the world, our willingness to embrace our own suffering can be a means of participating in the redemption of the world, bringing light to those around us even in the darkest times.
Biblical quote with explanation. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. Hebrews 12, verse 11. This passage reminds us that while suffering is difficult in the moment, it leads to growth. St. Francis's acceptance of suffering shows us that, in the end, our pain can bring us closer to God and to others. The fruit of righteousness is born through these trials, as we learn to trust in God's providence and embrace His will, even in the hardest of times. May we all learn to see suffering not as an enemy, but as a teacher, guiding us into a deeper relationship with Christ. St. Francis's life was a beautiful testament to the truth that true peace is found not in the absence of conflict, but in our relationship with God. His deep spirituality was not just a response to his own personal devotion, it was a way of being in the world that invited others into a life of radical trust in God. For Francis, the essence of peace was not an external circumstance, but an inner state of surrender and trust. This inner peace, rooted in faith, allowed him to face the world's troubles, its brokenness, and its suffering with calm and compassion. Jesus in the Gospel tells us, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. Not as the world gives do I give to you. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid." John 14:27. This peace, the peace of Christ, is not dependent on external circumstances or the absence of trials. It is a peace that transcends the world's understanding and is grounded in a deep, abiding relationship with God. St. Francis, throughout his life, demonstrated this peace in the way he responded to the world. He was not swayed by the chaos around him. Rather, he radiated God's peace even in the most challenging circumstances. Consider the moment in St. Francis's life when he was faced with the challenge of rebuilding the church of San Damiano. He was called to repair the physical structure, but the deeper task was to rebuild the church in the hearts of its people. The world around him was crumbling in many ways, spiritually, morally, and materially. Yet, despite these external pressures, Francis remained deeply grounded in the peace that comes from God. This inner peace enabled him to act not out of fear or anger, but out of love and trust in God's guidance. In the midst of a world that often seeks peace through control or escape, St. Francis teaches us that true peace is found in surrender. It is in the acceptance of God's will and the letting go of our own desires that we experience the peace that Christ promises. This is not a passive peace, but an active peace, one that invites us to engage with the world from a place of spiritual strength, not weakness. It is a peace that calls us to serve others, to love without expecting anything in return,
and to find joy in the simplest things.
One of the most profound expressions of peace in St. Francis's life was his relationship with nature. He saw the natural world as an expression of God's love and beauty. He called the sun brother, the moon sister, and the wind brother. His relationship with creation was one of reverence and harmony. This reverence for nature flowed from his deep inner peace. St. Francis understood that all of creation was connected and that peace was not just an individual experience, but a communal one. The more we are at peace with God, the more we are able to live in harmony with the world around us. St. Francis's radical peace also extended to his relationship with others, especially those who were marginalized or considered outcasts. He reached out to the lepers, the poor, and the sick, offering them love and dignity. His actions were a direct reflection of the peace he had cultivated within his own heart. The peace he experienced was not just for himself, but something that he shared freely with others. This is the true nature of peace. It is not a possession to be held tightly, but a gift to be shared with the world. Reflecting on St. Francis's life, we are reminded that peace begins within. It begins with surrendering our own will to God and trusting that He will guide us through the storms of life. This is not always easy, as the world often leads us to believe that peace comes through achievement, accumulation, or control. But St. Francis shows us that peace comes from letting go of these illusions and trusting in God's providence. It comes from a deep relationship with God where we can rest in His love and trust that He will provide for us no matter the circumstances. A simple prayer to help cultivate this inner peace might be, Lord, help me to trust in You fully, even in the midst of life's challenges. Fill my heart with Your peace, that I may share it with others. Teach me to surrender my will to Yours, knowing that You are always with me, guiding me, and loving me. This prayer is a reminder that peace is a gift from God, one that we must open our hearts to receive. As we surrender our will and trust in His love, we find peace not just in our hearts, but in every aspect of our lives. St. Francis also teaches us that peace is not something we create by force or control. Rather, it is the natural outpouring of a life lived in harmony with God. It is a peace that invites others in, that heals brokenness, and that restores relationships. This peace flows from a heart that is deeply rooted in God's love and trust in His plan. When we experience this peace, we are called to share it with the world, to be agents of reconciliation and love in a world that so desperately needs it. Biblical quote with explanation. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Matthew 5:9. This beatitude speaks to the heart of St. Francis's mission.
His life was a reflection of this truth, that peacemakers, those who live in harmony with God and with others, are truly children of God. To be a peacemaker is to embody the peace of Christ in all that we do, to bring that peace into every interaction, and to live as a witness to God's love and reconciliation. As we continue on our spiritual journey, let us remember that peace is not something we must fight for or create through our own strength. It is a gift from God, one that we must cultivate through trust, surrender, and a deep relationship with Him. Let us, like St. Francis, be instruments of God's peace in the world, spreading love, harmony, and compassion wherever we go. May the peace of Christ fill our hearts and guide our actions, today and always.